The saloon doors swung open with a creak that silenced laughter for just a moment, and then it began again. The mocking chuckles aimed at a cowboy who walked in with his hat pulled low, his boots worn, and his voice kept quiet. He never fought back against the jeers, never lifted his eyes to challenge the men who measured worth in gold coins and loud boasts. To the townsfolk, he was nothing but a shadow on the edge of the street, a figure too plain, too silent to matter in a world where noise and riches commanded respect. Yet behind his silence was a strength the town had not yet learned to fear. Day after day, the quiet cowboy carried his burdens alone, his back bent from work that never seemed to end. He was the first to rise with the dawn, the last to rest under the weight of the stars. But his humility made him invisible. To the men in polished boots, he was laughable. To the women with jewels on their fingers, he was forgettable. Still, he endured, because endurance was all he had. He lived by the code of the plains, to speak little, work hard, and let his actions tell his story when words would not. One evening, as the town gathered in the saloon, the laughter grew louder. Someone mocked the dust on his clothes. Another jeered at the silence he carried like armor. He took a seat at the edge, eyes cast to the floor, bearing the ridicule as though it were nothing more than the sting of the wind. The crowd fed on its own cruelty, but none noticed how the air shifted, how a presence unlike any other walked slowly into that room. She was the widow, a woman draped not in jewels but in stories, her wealth both admired and envied across the prairie. Her eyes held the weight of battles fought in silence. Her steps carried the dignity of a life marked by both loss and power. When she entered, conversations hushed, for no one dared to treat her with anything less than reverence. Yet what none expected was where she would choose to sit. Without a word, she crossed the room, her gaze steady, her silence commanding. And then she lowered herself onto the empty seat beside the quiet cowboy. The room froze, laughter cut short, as though the world itself had drawn in a sharp breath. For in that moment, without speaking a single word, the rich widow had rewritten the story of the man they mocked, proving that sometimes silence holds more power than the loudest voice, and that the worth of a soul cannot be measured in coins or cruel laughter. The room was thick with silence after the widow took her seat beside the quiet cowboy. Every eye in the saloon locked on them, disbelief spreading across faces twisted by mockery only moments before. The laughter that had once filled the air now lay buried under the weight of a silence sharper than steel. The cowboy did not move, did not even raise his gaze, but in that moment his presence seemed transformed. The jeers that once defined him were stripped away, and all that remained was the mystery of why a woman of such wealth and influence would choose to sit at his side. The townsfolk whispered among themselves, their voices hushed and frantic. Some claimed it was pity, others insisted it was scandal. But beneath the layers of gossip ran something far more dangerous: curiosity. What secret lay hidden in this man that a widow of fortune and dignity had recognized? The room buzzed with unspoken questions, each whisper turning the cowboy into more than a shadow. He was becoming a figure cloaked in enigma. The cowboy himself remained motionless, his silence unchanged, but inside his chest his heart beat heavy as a war drum. He had endured years of ridicule without complaint, knowing that words would never win respect. Now, the widow's gesture had thrust him into a spotlight he had never sought. He knew this choice of hers was no accident. It was a message to the town, and perhaps to him, that silence itself could carry power greater than any boast. The widow, calm and poised, ignored the whispers. She did not need to explain herself. Her actions spoke louder than the voices that once mocked. She sat with a grace that turned every eye toward her, yet her attention never wavered from the man beside her. In her silence, she elevated his. It was as though she had placed a crown on his head without saying a word, daring the town to see him as more than the dust on his boots. For the first time, the quiet cowboy felt the mocking eyes lose their sting. The laughter was gone, replaced by something he could not yet name: respect, envy, or perhaps fear. The West had always been a land where reputations were forged not by words but by moments. And in that single act of silent defiance, a new legend had begun to form. The days that followed carried the weight of that night. Wherever the cowboy walked, whispers trailed behind him. Men who once jeered now watched him with narrowed eyes, their pride wounded by the widow's choice. Women, once dismissive, looked twice, as if searching for the hidden quality that had caught the widow's gaze. His silence, once ridiculed, had become a veil of mystery, and mystery in the West was more dangerous than any six-shooter. The widow continued her defiance with a grace that unsettled the town. She was seen at his side more than once, at the market, on the church steps, even along the dusty street where wagons rattled by. Each time, she spoke little, but her presence was enough to silence tongues before they could speak. She was not a woman to be questioned, and her choice forced others to confront their own scorn. With every step she took beside him, she elevated the quiet cowboy into something larger than life. The cowboy, though unaccustomed to such attention, remained unchanged in his manner. He still worked the land with quiet diligence, still avoided boast and quarrel. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. The strength he had always carried in silence was now reflected back to him through the widow's gaze. He began to walk a little straighter, his shoulders less burdened by the weight of mockery. The respect he had never sought was now forced upon him, and though it felt strange, it also felt earned. The town itself began to fracture. Some called the widow reckless, accusing her of humiliating the man of standing by elevating a man of dust. Others, in hushed tones, admired her courage, saying she had revealed the truth that many refused to see, that true worth is not always loud or adorned in riches. The divide deepened, and with it, the cowboy's presence in the town became impossible to ignore. Through it all, the widow never explained herself. She never raised her voice, nor defended her choice. She simply remained, her silence a shield stronger than words, her presence a declaration no one dared challenge. And as the town wrestled with its own pride and prejudice, the quiet cowboy realized that his silence had never been weakness. It had been his greatest weapon, one that only the widow had recognized, and one that now, the entire town was forced to confront. Tension grew in the town like storm clouds gathering over the plains. Men of wealth and pride felt their authority slipping, unsettled by the widow's silent allegiance to the cowboy they had long mocked. They had measured their worth in land, cattle, and gold, but now their power seemed fragile in the face of something they could not buy: respect earned in silence. Their laughter, once sharp as knives, had dulled, replaced by unease that gnawed at their pride. The cowboy, unaware of the plots whispered behind closed doors, continued to live as he always had, quiet, steady, unshaken by the storms of gossip. Yet the widow's presence at his side painted a target on his back. What had once been simple ridicule turned into resentment, the kind of resentment that festered into danger. In saloons and back rooms, men with bruised egos spoke of teaching him his place, of proving that silence had no power against the weight of influence. But the widow was no stranger to the cruelty of men. She had seen greed strip away dignity, had watched pride turn friends into enemies. Her fortune had not protected her from sorrow, but it had sharpened her instincts. She sensed the growing hostility and stood even closer to the cowboy, her silent defiance becoming a shield he had never asked for, but one he desperately needed. Together, they walked through the town like a storm no one dared to face directly. One afternoon, as the sun burned over the dusty street, the tension finally broke. A group of men stepped forward, their voices loud, their accusations dripping with venom. They mocked not the cowboy this time, but the widow, daring to question her choice, daring to shame her for lowering herself. The crowd gathered, the air thick with expectation, waiting for the quiet cowboy to shrink away as he always had. But he did not. For the first time, he lifted his head, his eyes steady, his voice firm yet calm. He did not boast, he did not curse, he did not raise his hand in violence. He spoke only a few words, but in them lay the weight of a lifetime spent in silence. His words cut through the jeers like a blade, reminding them all that dignity does not shout, it endures. And as the widow placed her hand on his arm, the street fell quiet, for the truth of his strength could no longer be denied. From that day, the cowboy's silence was no longer seen as weakness. The town could not forget the moment he had stood, calm and unshaken, against the cruelty meant to break him. His strength, once invisible, had been revealed, and though some still mocked behind closed doors, none dared do so to his face. His quiet presence became a mirror, forcing others to confront their own noise, their own emptiness. The widow's choice now seemed less like pity and more like prophecy. She had seen in him what others had ignored, and with each passing day, the truth of her vision grew harder to deny. The townsfolk began to notice what they had overlooked: the steady way he worked, the patience in his eyes, the honor in his silence. What once made him a target of ridicule now made him a figure of respect, even among those who despised him. Yet respect in the West was never freely given. It was tested. The threats against him did not vanish. They shifted, taking quieter, more dangerous forms. The men whose pride he had unknowingly wounded plotted in shadows, waiting for a chance to strike. But the cowboy did not live in fear. He carried himself with the same calm he always had, as if daring the world to try and break what silence had already made unbreakable. The widow remained at his side, her presence a constant reminder that wealth and power did not always bend to society's will. Her choice to stand beside a man mocked for his simplicity became a defiance larger than either of them alone. Together, they became a story the town could not stop telling, a tale of silence and dignity shaking the very foundations of pride and arrogance. And so, under the vast skies of the Old West, the quiet cowboy and the widow carved their place in history, not with guns or riches, but with silence, courage, and a bond that silenced laughter more powerfully than any bullet ever could. The days rolled on, and the story of the quiet cowboy spread far beyond the dusty streets of the town. Travelers carried whispers of him to nearby settlements, each retelling shaping him into something larger than life. Some said he was a man who could stare down an army with nothing but silence. Others claimed the widow's fortune was now guarded by a spirit too steady to be shaken. Legends in the Old West often began with gunfire, but his was born in stillness, in the unyielding strength of a man who refused to bow to scorn. The widow saw these changes unfold with a quiet pride of her own. She had chosen him not for wealth, nor for power, but because she recognized something no one else had: a spirit unbroken. In her eyes, he was not a man remade by her choice, but a man revealed by it. And in revealing him, she had revealed herself, showing the town that her strength lay not in riches, but in the courage to defy its cruel laughter. Together, they had rewritten the meaning of silence. But the men who thrived on arrogance and control could not let go so easily. Their pride had been shattered in front of the widow and the entire town, and pride in the West was a dangerous thing. Whispers of revenge began to creep into the night, carried on the wind through saloon doors and across poker tables. These were not the whispers of laughter anymore. They were threats waiting for the right moment to strike. The cowboy, however, did not retreat. He continued to move through life with the same quiet dignity, though his eyes now scanned the horizon with sharper caution. He knew danger was coming. He had seen it too many times in the West, the way men whose power was threatened would rather bleed than admit defeat. But he also knew that fear would not serve him. Silence, patience, and steadiness had carried him this far, and they would carry him through the storm that brewed unseen. At the widow's side, he found something he had never known before: not just resilience, but purpose. His life had once been defined by survival alone, but now it was marked by defiance, by the unspoken promise that no cruelty would ever again reduce him to laughter's shadow. In her presence, his silence became not just strength, but a voice louder than all the jeers the West could muster. One fateful evening, as the sun bled into the horizon and shadows stretched across the street, the storm broke. A group of men, their pride wounded beyond repair, stepped out to confront the cowboy. Their voices rang with venom, their hands twitching near the handles of their guns. The townsfolk gathered, breathless, for this was the moment they had long anticipated, the moment silence would be tested by steel. The widow stood at a distance, her eyes locked on the man she had chosen. She did not speak, did not plead, for she knew that his silence carried more weight than her words ever could. Her presence was steady, unwavering, her trust in him unshaken. The cowboy, calm as the setting sun, did not flinch at the threats hurled his way. He stood in the center of the dusty street, hat low, hands still, his silence wrapping around him like armor. The men cursed, demanding he defend himself, demanding he break his silence. But the cowboy knew their rage was born of weakness, not strength. With every heartbeat, their noise made them smaller, while his silence made him larger. And then, when the first hand twitched too close to iron, his calm eyes lifted. With nothing but a steady gaze, he froze them where they stood. His silence was no longer absence. It was power, undeniable and unshakable. The crowd felt it. The air itself seemed to shift, the dust refusing to rise, the wind holding its breath. Even the men who sought to shame him faltered, their bluster drained by the weight of a man who needed no words to prove himself. They lowered their hands, not out of mercy, but out of fear. Fear of the strength they could not understand, fear of a power they could not touch. And as they retreated into the shadows, the cowboy remained still, his silence victorious once more. The widow stepped forward, her presence like a flame in the night, and stood beside him in the dust. Together, without a word spoken, they had silenced not just the laughter of the town, but the arrogance of men who thought themselves untouchable. In that moment, the quiet cowboy was no longer mocked, no longer underestimated. He was a legend etched into the very heart of the Old West. In the days that followed, the town carried a different air. Where once there had been laughter at the cowboy's expense, now there was reverence, mixed with unease. The saloon doors opened to hushed voices, and even the boldest men measured their words carefully when he walked by. The memory of his silence in the street, unyielding in the face of guns, hung over them like a shadow they could not escape. What had once been considered weakness had revealed itself as a strength greater than their own. Children began to watch him with wide eyes, whispering that he was braver than any gunman they had seen. Women, who had once dismissed him as nothing more than a dusty ranch hand, now spoke softly of his dignity and steadiness. Even the men who hated him most could not deny the truth. He had stood against them without firing a single shot, and still, he had won. The town, shaped by its harsh codes of pride and violence, was forced to bend to the power of something it had never respected: silence. The widow's choice now seemed prophetic. She had seen before anyone else what lay beneath the quiet cowboy's silence. Her presence at his side had not only shielded him from scorn, but had also turned his silence into a banner of strength. And though some still gossiped, their voices no longer carried the sting of ridicule, only bitterness at their own defeat. Each time she walked through town beside him, her dignity merged with his quiet strength, making them a pair no one dared to mock. Yet beneath the calm surface, the cowboy carried the weight of what had happened. He had not sought conflict, but conflict had found him. The West was a land that remembered grudges, and he knew that silence alone could not keep danger at bay forever. Still, he refused to let fear shape his steps. He continued his life as before, working the land, walking the streets, living with a quiet steadiness that unsettled his enemies and inspired those who watched from the shadows. For the first time in years, the cowboy felt as though he was no longer walking alone. The widow's trust had anchored him, the town's shifting gaze had reshaped him, and within his silence now lived not just survival, but meaning. He was no longer a man endured out of pity. He was a man defined by the strength no one could strip away. Seasons changed, and with them the rhythm of the town. The quiet cowboy became a figure woven into its fabric, his name whispered with a mixture of fear and admiration. Where once men boasted loudly in the saloon, now their laughter faltered when he entered. He carried no weapon that others could not match, no fortune that others could not buy. What he carried was rarer, a dignity untouchable by insult, unbroken by pride, and that had become more dangerous than any loaded pistol. The widow, ever steady, continued to defy the expectations of those around her. Wealthy men had once courted her with promises of power and comfort, but she had rejected them all. Her choice to stand beside the cowboy had not only changed his fate, but hers as well. She was no longer just the wealthy widow. They now saw her as the woman who could not be swayed by riches or pride, the woman who chose strength of character over everything else. Together, they became a silent force in the town. They spoke little, but their presence reshaped the very streets they walked. For every sneer that once mocked them, there were now bowed heads and cautious greetings. Their bond was not paraded in grand gestures or loud declarations, but lived in quiet moments, an unspoken unity stronger than all the noise the West could summon. But not everyone welcomed this change. In the corners of the town, men who thrived on arrogance and control still whispered of revenge. Their pride had been broken, and pride in the Old West did not heal easily. They plotted in silence, waiting for a moment to reclaim what they believed was theirs. Yet the cowboy, calm as ever, seemed to know this truth. No matter how loud their threats, the quiet strength he carried could not be undone. The story of the quiet cowboy and the widow was no longer just theirs. It had become the town's. It was a tale retold around fires and across tables, a reminder that in a land where power was often measured by violence and wealth, sometimes the greatest force was the one that made no noise at all. As the months stretched on, the quiet cowboy's presence became a part of the town's rhythm, a steady reminder that silence could bend even the harshest winds of ridicule. No longer did men mock him in the saloon. No longer did children point and laugh. Instead, heads dipped in acknowledgment as he passed, and conversations quieted, not out of fear alone, but out of respect. He had become something the West rarely allowed, a living legend carved not by violence, but by the strength of his restraint. The widow's loyalty never wavered, and in her steadiness, the town found its reflection. She stood beside him not as a woman guarding her reputation, but as a partner who had chosen dignity over wealth, truth over pretense. Her silence beside him had carried as much power as his own, and together, they shaped a legacy that stretched further than the dusty streets they called home. She had not only raised him in the eyes of the town, she had revealed to the town the emptiness of its own scorn. But life in the West was never free of shadows. Strangers began to ride in, drawn by the tale of the man who won battles without a gun. Some came seeking wisdom, others came seeking to test him. The cowboy met each challenge with the same quiet steadiness, never seeking glory, never raising his voice. Those who came with arrogance left humbled. Those who came with respect found themselves changed by the simple truth that greatness did not always roar. It could also whisper. For the townsfolk, the lesson lingered long after each encounter. They realized the cowboy's strength had never been born from power or wealth, but from the courage to endure humiliation without surrendering his spirit. His silence was not empty. It was filled with meaning, with patience, with the kind of resolve that men of pride could never understand. And that truth unsettled them more than any drawn weapon ever could. The cowboy himself did not seek to be a legend. He lived as he always had, quietly, steadily, carrying his dignity like a shadow that never left him. But deep down, he knew the West had changed him. He was no longer the man mocked at the edges of the saloon. He was no longer the shadow of the town's cruelty. He was a man defined by silence, by resilience, and by the bond he shared with the widow who had dared to see him when no one else did. The years passed, and with them the seasons of hardship that marked life on the frontier. Droughts came and went, storms raged across the plains, and still the quiet cowboy endured. His silence became a language the town learned to respect, a reminder that not every battle needed a shout, not every victory required blood. His life was proof that in a land where pride often led to ruin, humility could carve out a strength that no storm could erase. The widow remained by his side, her presence as constant as the turning skies. Together, they were a symbol to all who watched, of defiance against cruelty, of dignity that outlasted scorn, of love that needed no words. Their bond became a tale told by travelers, a story that outlived them, carried on by voices who whispered to the cowboy who turned laughter into silence and silence into legend. And though there were always those who tried to challenge him, their efforts only deepened the truth of his story. Each test, each confrontation, only proved that silence could be stronger than steel. The quiet cowboy did not seek to win over the world. He simply refused to let it break him. In that refusal, he became greater than the men who sought to measure worth with noise and gold. The town itself bore his mark. Where once cruelty thrived, there now lingered caution, respect, even reflection. People began to understand that words, so easily sharpened into weapons, could also reveal weakness. And silence, so easily mocked, could carry the weight of entire worlds. The quiet cowboy had taught them that. By the time his story became legend, the laughter that had once filled the saloon was long forgotten. In its place remained the image of a man who spoke little, yet whose presence spoke louder than any boast. The quiet cowboy and the widow who sat beside him had proven one thing the West would never forget, that sometimes the strongest voice is the one that never needs to be raised. The story of the quiet cowboy and the widow is not simply one of silence and defiance. It is a lesson carved into the very heart of the Old West. What began as a tale of mockery and humiliation transformed into a powerful reminder that dignity cannot be stripped away by laughter, nor can honor be silenced by arrogance. His silence, once seen as weakness, became a force that humbled pride and redefined strength in a land where men often measured worth by noise and violence. The widow's choice to stand at his side gave weight to this truth. She saw what others refused to see, that greatness does not always shout. It often endures quietly, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Her courage to defy expectation showed that true wealth is not measured in land or gold, but in the character we choose to honor. Together, they turned ridicule into reverence, and their bond became a testament to the power of steadfastness and trust. This story reminds us that in life, as on the frontier, silence can be louder than words, and stillness stronger than force. We live in a world that often confuses volume with power, yet the quiet cowboy teaches us that true strength lies not in how loudly we speak, but in how firmly we stand. His life was proof that resilience, humility, and dignity can silence even the cruelest laughter. Perhaps the greatest lesson is this: every person mocked, underestimated, or ignored carries within them a fire waiting to be seen. Sometimes all it takes is one act of recognition, one hand that chooses to sit beside another in defiance of the crowd, to transform a shadow into a legend. And when that happens, the story lives far beyond the dust of its beginning. It becomes a reflection of our own struggles, our own need for courage, and our own search for meaning. If this story moved you, let it linger in your thoughts. Reflect on the strength of silence, on the dignity that cannot be broken, and on the courage it takes to stand firm when the world mocks. And if you wish to keep exploring stories that stir the soul and carry the timeless spirit of the Old West, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice helps keep these legends alive, echoing across the frontier long after the final word is spoken.